So I'm talking today about the MacArthur, which is one of the 11 tools that the Lead K committee selected as being appropriate instruments for children deaf or hard of hearing from birth to age 5. This particular instrument is for birth to 3, although it can be used with children who have language delays who are older, but who have language levels in that birth to 3 range. As Elizabeth said, I'm Allison Setti. I'm at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm a speech pathologist and an audiologist, and I'm also the director of the Early Language Outcomes Lab. So today is all about the MacArthur, and I'll just start with a disclaimer, which is that I am not paid by Brooks Publishing to promote the MacArthur, but it is probably currently, well, certainly one of my favorite language assessments, and might even rise to the very top. Not to say that it's perfect. There is no perfect language assessment out there, unfortunately, but one of the things I'll open with today are just what I see as some of the benefits of the MacArthur Bates. I typically refer to it just as the MacArthur, which is probably what I'll say throughout the presentation. After we go over some of the things that I like about this assessment, particularly with children who are deaf or hard of hearing, I'll describe the 3 different levels because the MacArthur Inventories ends with an S because there are actually 3 inventories designed for different age levels and/or language levels. So as I'm describing each, I'll touch briefly on interpreting the results that you might get if you were to do the assessment and submit it to our lab, or if you were just do it and score it yourself, and how you might look at those results and use them in your intervention practice or your school. We'll talk about administration instructions. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the instrument, we'll talk about how you would actually administer it. Fortunately, very simple. So that won't take too long to explain. And then I'm going to talk about considerations of using this assessment if you are working with a child who uses a language other than English. So let's start out with some of the things I like about the instrument. I am a big fan of standardized norm referenced assessments, not to say that that should be the only thing in your assessment battery, because there's a lot of value in developmental checklists, age benchmarked assessments, criterion referenced assessments. And ideally, you want to have a nice range of different types of assessments that you're using. But I do think having at least one standardized norm referenced assessment is super important. This particular instrument, one reason why I love it is it was normed on a very, very large sample of children, thousands of children. And so it's very representative of how children are producing language in this birth to 3 period. And by using a standardized and norm referenced assessment as part of your battery, you can objectively see if the child is within the average range, which is not really something you can do with an age benchmarked list or a developmental checklist. You can get a rough idea of the age level a child is at, but if they're a little maybe below their age level, it's not clear, unless it's norm referenced, whether the child's actually still within the average range or not. I also love the MacArthur because it relies very heavily on parent input, which is critical in that birth to 3 period. Becomes more and more critical the less you know the child. But even when you have weekly visits with a child or they come to your 2-day-a-week toddler group, you're still not going to see everything that they're able to do from a linguistic standpoint. And so having that parent input is super important. And I also think there's a lot of benefits to the parent of thoughtfully considering what their child is able to do from a linguistic standpoint. Probably the number one thing I like about this assessment is that it's sensitive to language gaps that are often apparent in children who are deaf or hard of hearing. So many of the more general tests that I like and use, like for example, the DAISY, which is also one of the 11 recommended assessments, something that we use very commonly in our lab. It's a great assessment, but oftentimes people get scores back from that and feel like, I thought the child had more gaps than is apparent from this assessment. I'm getting back scores that the child is in the average range, but maybe that's not my personal perception of what's happening. And for a variety of reasons, those more general communication tests that go down to the birth, to 12-month period will often miss gaps because they're giving points for nonverbal communication that children who are deaf or hard of hearing typically don't have any difficulty with unless they have cognitive disabilities. And so that's buffering their score. And sometimes I think obscuring language gaps that actually exist, whereas the MacArthur focuses 100% on language. And when it does look at gestures and nonverbal communication, that's its own separate score. You can use this test to monitor progress over time, and I think it leads very nicely to intervention goals, which we'll talk again briefly about today, but something we might do in more detail if there's interest in a future presentation. So, for those of you not as familiar with the test, let's talk about what it is. So, you have two options when you select which of the three inventories you're going to use. From Michigan's database standpoint, I would encourage you to select the level that's correct for the child's age. That's the only way you're going to get back percentile ranks and the only way to really know what percentage of children in the state have language levels in the average range and what percentage of children might be either above or below the average range. But I would also encourage you, if time permits, to do a second level, if necessary, based on the child's language level. So suppose you have a child who's, let's say, 30 months old, or well, let's make them a little older. Let's say 33 months old, close to transition to Part B. Um, from an age standpoint, they should get the level 3. So you can see the level 3 here on the screen is designed for children from 30 to 37 months. So your 33-month-old should take the level 3 so that you can get percentile ranks. However, if you feel that particular student has language that's more like, let's say, a 24-month-old, you'll also get some really great valuable information by also doing the words and sentences inventory, because that's going to give you a more specific age level. So while you won't get percentile ranks because the child's out of the range chronologically, their age is out of the range of the test, you still will get an age score and often more information that's more clinically valuable than doing a test where they really are not at the language level that's expected for that particular inventory. The nice thing about the level 3, even though it's quite, advanced from a linguistic standpoint, is it is very short. So it's only 2 pages, it's quick and easy. And so it's really typically not a big ask to say, hey, let's do that level 3 inventory so we get our percentile ranks and make a meaningful contribution to Michigan's database. But let's also do the words and sentences, which is more time consuming. Since we were able to do this level 3 so quickly, probably literally in 5 to 10 minutes, if the child's language is really closer to the words and sentences level, and then do the words and sentences as well. If you do submit the assessments to our lab at CU Boulder, we're happy to score both. In fact, we're thrilled to score both and provide both to you back in a report. So don't ever hesitate to do more than one level. So the words and gestures, starting with that level, it is designed for children from 8 to 18 months. It assesses a variety of areas, some comprehension, some expression. And I'll just say generally that all three of the levels, the primary focus is on expressive vocabulary. So that's the common thread between the three inventories, is that all three of them are going to assess expressive vocabulary. But each level will have additional pieces that are appropriate for that age level or that language level. So in that early words and gestures version, in addition to looking at expressive vocabulary, it also is going to look at comprehension of phrases, comprehension of words, so not just production of words, but also comprehension of words, communicative gestures, so nonverbal communication, things like pointing at things, reaching out for something they want, waving bye-bye, that sort of thing. And then there's also some really nice sections on symbolic use of objects and symbolic play, which I like a lot. So this is what the crux of the words and gestures looks like. This is a little chunk of the vocabulary section. So you can see there's 3 columns. The first one says understands, the second one says, the third one says signs. And so what the family would do, and you can weigh in on this as well, or anybody else who has interactions with the child can weigh in. You're going to tick off those words that the child understands, that they say, that they sign. And you'll get separate counts, separate scores for the understands versus the production, the says and the signs. You can see the words are divided into semantic categories. So in this example, I pulled vehicles, toys, food, and drink. But in the words and gestures, I think it's 21 semantic categories, something in that ballpark. So you're going to look at lots of different kinds of words that the child might use. The gesture section that I mentioned, the communicative gestures, here's a little look at what that looks like. The child, the parent, and you and anybody else weighing in would indicate for each of these items, is this something the child's not doing yet? Do they do it sometimes, or is this something they do often? So these are these things like shakes their head no, gestures hush by placing their finger to their lips, extends their arm to show you they're holding something. So again, very early skills. What I really love about this section, we'll talk about in a minute, is that it gives you a little glimpse into the child's cognitive ability, because these sorts of communication um, attempts are really dependent on cognition. And children who are deaf or hard of hearing typically will score very well in this section. And it's a really nice thing to show parents that the child, even if they might not be producing formal language yet, true words, true signs, spoken words, um, that they are communicating and that that's the foundation or the building blocks. This is the section on symbolic play. It's also called gestures. These are considered the later gestures, but it's really symbolic play items. So, with a doll or a stuffed animal, will the child, rock it, kiss it, put it to bed, etc. And again, symbolic play, highly tied to cognitive ability, so gives you a little glimpse into the child's cognition and their cognitive skills. So just, we're a big group and we don't have a ton of time, so I'm not going to unfortunately make this super interactive, but you can think on your own. Just kind of think to yourself, okay, these gestures we just looked at, the nonverbal communication, the symbolic play, what would you expect a child to score if they were deaf or hard of hearing and they have no additional disabilities? And again, you don't need to respond except for in your own head. So these communicative gesture sections, the symbolic play, the use of objects, as I said, are strongly related to cognition. So children who are deaf or hard of hearing typically do not have delays in the gesture section. And so that's something, when you get your scores back, or if you score this yourself, if you see that the child is not doing well in that cognitive type section, the gesture section, again, think to yourself, what might be related to a low score? And we're not going to really go into depth about percentile ranks and age scores. I think most of you are familiar with that from whatever tests you do rely on. But below the 16th percentile would be more than a standard deviation from the mean. And so that's often what I'm looking at on this test is the child below the 16th percentile, meaning are they more than a standard deviation outside the mean? Because this is, I will say, a pretty tough test that often children who are deaf or hard of hearing do show some gaps on. Sometimes I'll even look more like, be a little more forgiving and say 10th percentile. If they're at the 10th or above, I feel like things are going reasonably well. Below the 10th percentile, that's a really significant delay. So let's see you see a score in the gesture section below the 16th percentile or below the 10th percentile. What might be happening in that situation? Because we just said typically being deaf or hard of hearing is not going to give you a low score in that section. Score should be typical. So cognitive delay might be something that you want to consider. And again, please, this is not a cognitive assessment. So this is not an IQ test by any stretch. You would never make a diagnosis of cognitive delay just based on this alone, but it could be a red flag for cognitive delays, causing you to then explore this more deeply, or at least keep a very close eye, and perhaps administer again in 6 months and be looking at other cognitive skills, seeing if you feel like they're where they should be. So that's one thing to consider when you see a low gesture score. Another thing to consider is potential social pragmatic concerns like autism spectrum disorder. And again, this is by no means a test of autism spectrum disorder, but just something that could alert you to this being a possibility and something that you want to explore a little bit deeper. The other thing, though, could be more just environmental, a lack of exposure, because we have in some circumstances seen when families are focusing very strongly on spoken language, they sometimes are reluctant to even gesture because either perhaps they've been told or what they've been told, what they interpreted the person to mean, maybe not really what they meant, was that, you really shouldn't be doing anything with your hands at all. You should just be talking to your child. And so there are occasional families who aren't even just doing natural gestures, which is not, what we want, of course, because the found even if a child's going to use spoken language, the foundation of spoken language is communicative gestures. So we want families to be doing that. We want them to be encouraging their child to be using those gestures and responding to those gestures to take meaningful conversational turns. And so that's something to consider too, that there might not be really a more serious problem like a cognitive delay or autism spectrum disorder, but really just that the child hasn't had a lot of opportunity to be rewarded for their gestures, so they aren't using them much, or to even be exposed. So that, could be a first much lighter level to explore if you see low gesture scores. A resource that I really like, especially when you do see a family where the child's gesture scores are a bit low and it doesn't seem like there should really be any reason for that. There's a website called First Words Project, and they have two really nice handouts. One's called 16 Gestures by 16 Months. The other is 16 Actions by 16 Months. It's available in English and Spanish. You can share a link with the family. You can print the resource. It parallels the MacArthur gesture section almost perfectly. So the 16 gestures by 16 months is pretty much those nonverbal communicative gestures in that section A. The 16 actions by 16 months is the symbolic use of objects, which is section C. So really nice handout to share with families, really colorful pictures showing children doing, not just drawings, but actual photographs of children doing the different gestures. And just if you haven't seen it yet, I'd encourage you to look at that website and download those handouts. So let's move on to words and sentences. Words and sentences is for the next age group, which is 16 months to 30 months. The primary focus of words and sentences is expressive vocabulary. There's a couple of other little pieces that I love. Which are not actually listed here, just about how children are using their language, but we're going to take a look at examples of that. There's also a section on irregular nouns and verbs. Does the child produce children, men, ran, ate? So those irregular verbs and irregular nouns, that's obviously very specific to English. And one of the things we'll talk about when we talk about potentially using this with children who are not using English is that you would not do that section because it really wouldn't make sense in any other language. And then there's a short section on sentence length, asking you to list the child's three longest sentences that they're currently using. So here's the vocabulary section of words and sentences. You can see it looks slightly different than words and gestures because it's missing a column. Words and gestures, remember, have three columns to tick off. Once you get to the stage that a child is using lots of words, it's very hard to know what they understand without doing a direct test of that. And so as the child's progressing linguistically, and moving on to words and sentences, we don't do the understands it column anymore. So you're just looking at words the child says or signs. There's more words than there are on words and gestures to pick from because ideally the child's expanding their vocabulary as they're getting older. Here's a section I love on this particular assessment. It's super simple, but it's really informative. It's called How Children Use Words. And this is great for any language. That's another thing I love about it because it's not asking about English grammar. It's just asking about how the child's using their language. And basically, all these questions are asking about, is the child talking beyond the here and now? So do they talk about the past, the future, people who aren't present, things that aren't present? Do they understand when you talk about things that aren't present? And this is a really important, obvious linguistic step, and really nice to get a handle on whether children are doing that or not. And I'll show you in a minute how when you get your results back, you can get an idea of if they're not doing that, if that's a delay or if that's just typical for their age. And then here's that word ending and irregular word section I was talking about. So these sections are very specific to English. They're looking at, do they add an S to the end of words? Do they add the ED? So the previous section is just saying, do they talk about the past? They don't have to do it with an ED ending. They just have to be talking about the past, even if they're not marking it grammatically. In this section, word endings, this is asking specifically, are they using English grammar to do those things? And then we have that irregular noun and verb section that I mentioned. So with the words and sentences, let's talk a little bit about using those results. First of all, the test form is your best friend because so much of the information that you need to guide your intervention is not the scores as much. The scores are helpful in certain ways, but it's the test form itself that's really the most valuable. And one of the things you want to look at on that form is there a nice spread of vocabulary across the various semantic categories? So again, it's divided into these semantic categories. And in typical language acquisition, for every 10 nouns a child produces, and this is in the early stages, the kind of the birth to 2.5-year-old stage, they should be producing 3 to 6 other types of words. So for every 10 nouns, you should have 3 to 6 descriptive words, action words, connecting words, helping verbs, that sort of a thing. Children who are deaf or hard of hearing, and actually really all children who have delays in language, tend to be noun heavy. So they tend to have lots of, their vocabulary proportionally tends to have a lot of nouns, names of things, and is often sparse in verbs, adjectives, and those sorts of things. And so that test form can be really just at a glance, can bring that to your and the parents' attention. And you want to focus on vocabulary in the categories where the child's not doing a lot. So we often see that children who are deaf or hard of hearing will be able to do lots of animal names. They can say or sign the names of lots of animals. They also often can say or sign colored words. They often can say or sign politeness forms, things like please and thank you. That's not typical. That's typical of children who you're teaching language to, not children who are acquiring language naturally. So if you were to look at the proportion, the MacArthur has a huge word bank where you can see what percentage of kids can say a variety of different words. A typical hearing 24-month-old child, 51% of those children can say the word orange, and only 40% can say the word black. So half or less are using colored words. However, they're using, like 2/3 of the kids are using adjectives like dirty and cold. And so, from a typical language acquisition standpoint, the heavy focus that we often see and often it's driven by sign instruction, because you'll teach a semantic category. Let's learn all the animals. Let's learn all the color words. Um, that pattern of learning animals and color words and please and thank you first is not typical. It's much more typical to have, in a sense, really more useful words like cold, dirty, things that you can use to communicate with somebody your thoughts, your feelings, your wants, your needs. So that's something to keep in mind as you're looking across the category is that you don't want to see this heavy, lots of check marks in animals and very sparsely checked off, let's say, in the descriptive words and the action words. So this is just a little example of how, you might see that played out. So I just cut out a little piece of the animal names, and you can see, lots of check marks on different animals. And then the action words, pretty sparsely checked off, just a few basic action words, mainly around food, eating and drinking, and not a whole lot more. And that to me is where, again, the test form is your friend, and you can say, oh, wow, we really need to put some focus on action words, maybe lay off the animals for a while because child seems to be developing those just fine. But it will be difficult for the child to combine words if they're super noun heavy because we don't string sentences together with multiple nouns. We combine nouns with verbs, nouns with adjectives, etc. And they're going to need those action words and those descriptive words to be creating short phrases and then longer sentences as well. So I would recommend making a copy of the test form for the family. Another thing that's a really nice thing to do with that test form is to have the family actually look through it, and they should have looked through it because they'll have, been participating in the actual assessment, checking the words off their child knows, and have them identify some words they don't even use with their child. So not, the form is designed to be what's the child using. But the child is not going to use words that the parents don't use themselves, unless until they get to school age and start hearing and seeing words in school and other children using them. But it's really nice to do that because oftentimes parents will say things like, well, he doesn't use the word, snow because, well, you don't have this problem in Michigan. But California, they might say he doesn't use the word snow because, he's never seen snow. It doesn't snow here. Or, well, he doesn't use church because we don't ever say church. We don't go to church. Or he doesn't use candy because I don't let him have candy. I don't even want to talk about candy. And oh no, he doesn't use the word hate because that's a harsh word and we don't use that word in our house. And that's all well and good that the family doesn't have a tendency to use those words, but it's important to help the family understand that other people do use those words, and it's important that their child understands them. So even if it's something that they're going to tell their child, don't say that word, or, sorry, you don't get any candy. Um, it is important for the child to know the word, to understand the word, and to be able to use the word if necessary, not just for, conversational purposes, but also for later reading purposes. And so helping the family, coaching them on ways that they can expose their child to words that aren't typical for them to use so that their child can learn those words and know what they mean can be a really important part of the intervention process. Another thing I like to do with the MacArthur is, and this goes back to the age scores and the percentiles that you'll get, is sharing with families from the beginning the magnitude of vocabulary growth that is needed each month for their child to stay on track with typical language acquisition. And it is sort of astounding how much a typically developing child is learning and expanding their vocabulary month to month in that not so much the 12-month to 16-month period, or even the MacArthur Go does it down to 8 months, 8 months to 16 months. So in that words and gestures level of the MacArthur, you don't expect a tremendous amount of vocabulary growth month to month. About 10 to 15 words a month is typical. But once the child hits words and sentences, so that there's 16 months, getting close to 1.5, in typical language acquisition, that's where you see that explosion of vocabulary that people talk about, or exponential growth of vocabulary. Because at that point, children are typically learning 37 new words a month, producing those words, saying or signing 37 new words a month. That's a lot. And preparing a family in advance for that is very important because they often will see in that words and gestures phase that their child it does appear to be on track linguistically in terms of their age score or their percentile rank. And then it's often disappointing when they get to words and sentences when the rate of growth is staying the same, but suddenly their child is showing delays because the rate of growth does not stay the same in typical language development. When a child hits 1.5, there is this explosion that happens, and families need to be prepared for this and how to expose their child to words so that they can keep up with that. So, one of the things you can share with family is what basically the average vocabulary size is at different age levels. So they know what they're shooting for and how much exposure their child needs in very meaningful contexts. So, at 12 months old, I mean, some children aren't even using words at all, and that's not atypical, that's okay. But the average child is using about 9 words. 6 months later, they have 70 more, on average, 70 more words. They're at 79 words. So 6 months goes by, they're supposed to gain about 70 words. It's pretty reasonable, doable. But another 6 months later, they have to gain another 200 words to stay on track. 279 words now is typical at 2 months, 24 months of age or 2 years of age. So that's a huge difference in the rate of language growth, and families need to be aware that this is what's typical and this is what they're shooting for with their children. Another thing I like to do with the results, and this is what you would get back if we were to score the assessment and send you back the results. We send back a sheet, a tabular sheet of the words and sentences results. Um, you can look this up in the manual yourself as well if you score one yourself. But this is that little section about talking about the past, the future, things that aren't present. So talking beyond the here and now. And by talking slash signing, so or using English or using any other language. So are they producing language about the past, about the future? And you can look and see the response in that middle column. And if you see, no, the child is not doing that, then what you want to look at is the next column, because this is where we're going to put what percentage of children who are the same age as your child are doing that skill. So, what percentage of children, for example, are talking about the past or signing about the past? Um, and we can see here in this example, 83% of 26-month-olds, which is how old this child is, 26 months old, 83% of children are doing that. We see in the response column, this child is not doing that yet. They're not communicating about the past. So that would be a great goal, because if 83% of kids who are the same age are doing this skill, we would want this child to do the skill as well, assuming they have typical cognitive skills. And so, you can look at these percentages and say, well, what would be, sort of the first thing we'd really want to be emphasizing? Well, I would pick the one that the most kids are doing. So, but this child's not. So that would be actually this bottom skill names the owner of an object when the owner is not present. So in other words, there's shoes on the floor, they belong to the dad, he's not in the room. The child can point at the shoes and say, Daddy, and label the owner of the object even when the owner's not there and not wearing the shoes. 93% of children who are 26 months old can do that. But this particular child in this example is not. We can see from their response. That would be a perfect thing to be focusing on with the family and coaching the family about. And you'll get similar percentages from us with these word endings as well. So for those children who are using spoken English, where the word endings is relevant, that would be another section you might look at. So you might look at, the bottom there uses the past tense ed. Child's not doing it. We can see in the response column, but only 44% of children who are 26 months old are doing that skill. So that's probably not something to be too, focused on. Not that, you're not going to use the past tense. Of course you will, but it's not something you might be highlighting acoustically or putting a lot of emphasis on. Whereas the plural endings, the S at the end of words, 3/4 of kids are doing that. 76% of kids are doing that. So that would be something that you would want to focus on, because this child's not doing that yet. So MacArthur level 3, let's move on to that. That's the next level, last level. It's for children who are between 2.5 and 3, so 30 months to 37 months. Again, it's got a section on expressive vocabulary. That's the common thread across the MacArthurs. But it also looks at sentence length and complexity and the use of conceptual language. So now, because the child hopefully has a very large vocabulary and it would be very difficult to capture the whole thing, they've selected 100 words to examine and determine if the child's saying or signing those 100 words. They vary in difficulty from very early developing words like drum, cracker, to more advanced vocabulary that develops later, like yesterday, yourself, between, etc. So it has a nice mixture of some earlier developing words and some later developing words. The sentence complexity section is short. This is the whole thing. It's not just a snippet. There's 12 pairs of sentences, and you're to check off which one is more like how the child is currently producing language. The first sentence is always a simpler, shorter sentence. The second one's always a little bit longer, more complex sentence. Again, this section is very specific to English, and so if the child is not using spoken English, you would not do this particular section. The advanced language use could be done with any language. And I love this section. It looks at all the different ways a child, well, not all of them, but many of the different ways that a child might use language. So, for example, number 4, does your child give reasons for things using the word because? Number 5, if you asked your child, what is a horse? He could answer an animal. So these are cognitive linguistic skills. Some of them are pragmatic skills, and they rely on using more than a single word because many of them will say things like, gives reasons using the word because. Well, it has to be because of something. So there's going to be more than one word. Ask questions with more than one word that begin with why or how. So now we're looking at, again, advanced language use. This section I love because in terms of setting goals, if the child has sufficient vocabulary, you could work on any of those 12 items, and they would be great things to have the family focusing on. But the child does need the linguistic foundation for it. So you want to look at their vocabulary size. And again, the level 3 is just going to be a sample of 100 words. So you have to kind of think, okay, this 2.5-year-old, more or less, how many words can they produce? Say or sign. Once they can produce about 200 words, you expect at least a few of the skills at the top. The list of 12 more or less goes in a developmental sequence. The top ones develop earlier than the ones at the bottom. So you'd expect the first few to be developing by the time a child had about 200 words, but you would expect most of those skills by the time they have about 500 words. So if you have a child that has pretty decent vocabulary, any of those 12 linguistic skills would be excellent goals to have for the family to be focusing on if the child's not doing those yet. So let's talk a little bit about considerations if you're working with a family who does not use English. So everything we've looked at obviously is in English. We see that there's adaption for sign, but let's start with families who speak Spanish. So the beautiful thing is that there is a Spanish version of the MacArthur Communicative Development Inventories that's available. It can be made available to you if you're submitting assessments for the Michigan database. We have those with our adapted forms with the sign column available in Spanish to you. If you don't have those or don't know how to get them, please contact Sarah Sybil about that. Or if you're purchasing test forms yourself, just the standard test forms, you can purchase a Spanish version. The beauty of the Spanish version of the MacArthur is it's not just a translation. So many published tests that are available in Spanish, they just translated the English version. And often you're comparing the child to English norms of English speaking children. That's not the case with the MacArthur. The MacArthur is not a direct translation. The words are actually different to some extent. There's a lot of overlap. I think about 80% of the words are the same on the English and Spanish version. But the Spanish version was developed by picking words that were linguistically and culturally appropriate for young children who are in Spanish speaking homes. And it's also normed on children in Spanish speaking homes. So it's one of the few tests available out there that's not just translated into Spanish, but actually normed on a very large group of children who are Spanish speakers. Um, what about families who use sign language? The test forms that I've been showing you snippets of are ones that we have adapted with the publisher's permission to include that signs column. If you were to buy the test form from the publisher, or if you have that and you were looking at my snippets, you probably were saying, this doesn't look like what I know from purchasing these test forms. That's because we adapted the forms to add that signs column and have the publisher's permission to do so. What about families who are using languages in addition to English or Spanish? So their child maybe is using some English, some Spanish, but they also are using other languages. I would encourage you to still use the MacArthur in that situation. I think it still works really nicely, but make sure that the family is clear that they need to check off all the words their child produces regardless of what language they're producing it in. So if they are signing some words, they're ticking off the sign column. If they're saying words in English, they're obviously checking off the says column. But if they're also saying words, let's say in Japanese or in an Arabic language, they should be checking those off as well because we want the child to receive credit for all of the words they can produce in any and all of their languages. And so that's just something because it's going to be written in English, obviously, that in your instructions you want to make clear to the family. What about the families who don't use any English or Spanish? Because we're going to encounter those families too. I'll just start by saying I don't know that the MacArthur is the best choice for that situation. Unfortunately, I don't know what is the best choice because this is a tough situation because the tests that are available to us here in the United States are tests of English typically. Because the United States has a large Spanish-speaking population, some test publishers have developed tests that are available in Spanish as well. But it's not typical to have a test that's developed in any other language that you can purchase and that would have norms that you can rely on. Now, some people who are very familiar with MacArthur might be saying, hey, wait, I heard there's a Japanese version, or I heard there's one in Punjabi. And yes, that's true. The MacArthur actually, there are versions, like, I don't even know how many languages at this point, but I want to say maybe 35 different languages. However, the manual is also written in that language. So if you don't speak that language fluently, you're not going to be able to administer or score the test because it's not that there's 35 translations of the test. The MacArthur people actually have encouraged people to do adaptations and to do other languages, but they also have encouraged them not to just do a direct translation. So they have their own norms, their own manual, obviously their own set of words, and if you're fluent in the language, theoretically, I guess you could purchase it. But if you have one or two families, you might not want to make an investment of several $100s for test forms and a test manual. And you definitely would need to be able to fluently read the language of the manual. So even though there are technically all these, MacArthur's available in different languages, they're not really typically of use to us here in the United States. So if the family doesn't use any English or Spanish, let's say the child's only using Japanese, the MacArthur might not be the best choice. But because there's not a lot of alternatives, some people might feel like, you know what, I can still get some valuable information if I work through the interpreter and have we'll check off the words the child can, let's say, in Japanese or whatever their language is, based on the interpreter, telling them what each of the words is in their language, and then they can say, yes, my child can produce that word. But you definitely would skip that word ending section, the irregular word form section, the three longest sentences section, because the way that the grammar would work in another language could be completely different. This is also true for ASL. The vocabulary section, I think, still works very nicely for families who use ASL, but the grammatical word endings and the irregular word forms are not relevant to ASL, so you just wouldn't do those particular sections. Let's end our presentation today with talking about administration. How do you administer this test that we've just talked about? Mainly, you're going to be instructing parents, and they're going to be doing most of the work. So, but it's super important that they understand what they're supposed to do. And the biggest place where there can be misunderstandings is in this first bullet point. You need to make it clear to the family that they should only tick off a word if the child can produce it outside of an imitative context. So if the child could only say or sign a word if you say it first, then they don't mark it. So if they can only imitate a word, they're not marking it because my goodness, children go through a stage where they'll imitate anything. So you could be checking off all the words and they might not produce any of them spontaneously, but they'll copy anything you say. You don't want them to check off words if they can only copy it. But you do want them to check off words even if they're not produced perfectly. So if the child mispronounces a word or uses an approximation of a sign, let's say, for example, for mommy, Instead, they just put their index finger on their chin, be a baby version of the sign, that would count. Or if instead of saying the word ball, they just say ba, that would count as well. So they have to be trying, approximating the word, not just random hand babbling or speech babbling, but actually trying to say the word and making an approximation of the spoken word or the signed word, then they do get credit. And it is okay to prompt with a question. So by spontaneous use, it doesn't mean the child's just, throwing these out in spontaneous conversation. You can say, what's this? Or, what do you do with this thing? That's fine. But you can't prompt the word by saying, say please, or this is a ball, say ball. That wouldn't count if that's the only situation where the child uses it. The other thing, and this is something where you'll probably need to weigh in a bit on the decision making, is if the child says or signs a word that's different than what's written down, but it means the same thing, generally you can give credit, but you can't go overboard on this. So you should only give credit for an alternative word that the child uses if that word that they're using is at essentially the same level developmentally. So, for example, some allowable substitutions, one of the words in the food section is noodles. Well, a lot of families will say pasta. Pasta, noodles, if anything, maybe pasta is even slightly more advanced from a linguistic standpoint. So if they use the word pasta instead of noodles, that's totally fine. If the word on the list is Cheerios, but they say, they don't use Cheerios, they don't like Cheerios, they say Lucky Charms, that's totally fine because those are both types of cereal. It's not like one is a harder word than the other. But what's not allowable is if the family says that their child uses a more basic word. So let's say the word is tricycle and they say, oh, no, they say bike. Well, bike or bicycle is not as advanced as tricycle. Tricycle is a specific type of a bicycle. Same thing goes for, let's say the word on the form is jeans. And they say, oh, they don't say jeans, they just say pants. It's like, that's good. And pants might even be a word on the list that you can tick off, but you can't give credit for jeans if a child says pants because pants is a more general, more basic word. Jeans is a more advanced, more specific word. Same thing if the word is coffee and they say, well, they don't say coffee, they say drink. It's like, no, because coffee is a type of a drink that's more specific, it's more advanced. They would not get credit for that. So it's a bit of a judgment call. There's not really there's nothing you can look at for every single word to say what's allowable and what's not. You just have to use your professional judgment as to whether you feel like, yeah, that feels about the same difficulty level, same level of specificity. So, yeah, we can check that off. Or, no, but let's see if we can find that more basic word on the list so that your child does get credit for using that particular word. When you administer, so that's instructions, but then how do you administer it? There's actually a lot of options. And so I've listed some of them here. There's probably others. One thing you can do is just give the form to the family, give them the instructions and leave it for them to complete. Or send it to them ahead of time, ahead of your visit. You could send it electronically, or leave it 1 week and say, hey, here's how you do this. Could you please do this over the next week or two when I come back for my next visit? I'll pick it up from you. So that's an option. Um, Honestly, I don't think that's typically the best option, but for some families, especially if they've done it before, that might be a good option. It might also be a good option for a family you only see once a month. So if you're seeing a family very occasionally, you might feel like we have so much to cover that I really hate to take up my one time a month visit with this assessment. I think this family can do a great job without me if I just explain it. That might be a time you do that. Another option, which would be a little bit more support for the family, is you complete part of it with them during your visit, and then you leave it for them to finish. So you might not do the whole thing together, but you give it a start together. Make sure that you're both on the same page about how this is done, that they're not going too quick or going too slow through it. But then you leave it with them to finish up. And so that's kind of nice because then they can be thoughtful about it over the course of the week and maybe give some more credit for things that in the immediate they might not have given credit for. Another option, particularly if you feel like, this is a family that's going to really struggle to get this done, is to, if you know the child pretty well, you can get a start. So you can fill out everything you know the child's able to do, and then say, hey, I did what I could, but I know I don't see your child, 24/7 the way you do. I probably missed some things. Can you look through it and add to what I did? And that would be a time saver for the family. And also, for some families, it might result in a more accurate and thorough assessment of what their child can do. I like the one that I highlighted in green and put in italics, which is to explain the directions to the family and ask them to complete it during your session while you're engaging the child in a meaningful activity so that they're not distracted by the child and they feel like, something valuable is happening while they're doing something valuable. That way it gets done during the time period of the session. It doesn't get put in a pile and maybe lost or forgotten about and come back next week and it's like, oh shoot, sorry, we forgot. Everybody's busy. And then also you're there to answer questions, which is another nice thing about that method. And then also you can kind of peek over every once in a while and see how it's going. And if you feel like, oh, yikes, like why are they checking off so many things when this child's at a really basic stage? Or why are they not checking off very much when I know the child can use some of these words? And then you're right there, you can re-instruct. And then the final method, which would be, of course, the most time consuming, is really to sit there in more of an interview format and do the form together. Which, if the child's napping or something, that could be a perfect use of your session as well. The guiding principle you want to use is pick the option that you think is going to result in the most accurate representation of the child's skills. Because this is not something that's about somebody's opinion as much as it is about what is this child really doing? And that's where having numerous people weigh in can give a more thorough and valid assessment. And regardless of what method you pick, hopefully you pick the one that you think is going to give you the most accurate results. But you're going to, especially if you left it for the family or put a lot of it in their hands to do when you weren't there, you want to really look through that form for completeness. What I often see people do is when they get to a big section, like the action words, is they go, oh, wow, that's a lot. I'll come back to that later. And they flip to the next page, but then they forget to go back. And it's like a whole page will be blank in the context of a child who actually is getting a lot of things ticked off. And so you want to make sure that that didn't happen, but you also want to look for inconsistencies. So if at the end they said, yeah, the child's combining words, but they didn't give the example of the three longest sentences, which is at the very bottom of words and sentences, you want to go back and revisit that. And the biggest thing is you want it to match with your impression of the child. So if you get it back and you feel like, I'm concerned because this looks really different to me than my impression of the child, either there's a lot less checked off than you think the child can do, or conversely, there's a lot more checked off. You want to work with the family to make sure that the instructions were understood, that you get some examples of words that you're concerned about, that you're not sure the child really can produce spontaneously, and work through it until you get what you believe is a really accurate representation of the child. Because it's not good for anybody for us to give back scores that are not accurate. You don't want to share that with a family and have them believe their child is doing either more poorly than they really are doing or is somehow doing better than they really are doing, because that it would be better, really honestly, to do nothing at all than to have the scores misrepresent the child's skill level. And of course, it's obviously not good for a database either to be having invalid scores that are being entered. So that's where doing it during the session can be really helpful, because then you don't have to be like, oh my gosh, we have to start all over again because I didn't make the instructions clear or the family misunderstood, and now we've got to start all over again. Um, so that brings us to the end. That leaves us just a few minutes for questions or comments. And Sarah, I don't know if anybody's put anything in the chat that we want to address, or if anybody has a question that they would like to come off mute and ask in our remaining few minutes.